today's stories, we follow a woman who watched one Netflix documentary, then tried to conquer Everest. With nothing but misplaced confidence and expensive gear, she believed a single film had given her all the knowledge she needed. What followed was a collapse so preventable, it still haunts everyone who watched her. It was March 15th, 2016. At 29,032 feet above sea level, in the death zone of Mount Everest where oxygen levels drop to 1/3 of the sea level, and the human body begins dying with each passing minute, another climber had collapsed. The southeast ridge stretched upward through howling winds and sub-zero temperatures, its narrow path carved between towering ice formations and exposed rock faces. Dara Whitfield was 34, a marketing coordinator from Portland who spent most weekends binge-watching documentaries on her couch. She had no athletic background beyond occasional yoga classes and considered a local waterfall hike her biggest outdoor achievement. Her daily routine consisted of 8 hours at a desk job, takeout dinners, and Netflix marathons that stretched past midnight. She owned a gym membership she hadn't used in 2 years and got winded climbing the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment. 3 months earlier, she'd watched a climbing documentary that made summiting Everest look like an expensive but achievable bucket list item. The film focused on guided expeditions and portrayed the mountain as dangerous but conquerable with proper support. Dara told friends and co-workers that ordinary people could do extraordinary things with the right equipment and guidance. The documentary had featured several amateur climbers who reached the summit with minimal experience, and Dara repeatedly referenced these examples when explaining her decision to attempt the climb. When questioned about her lack of climbing experience, she dismissed concerns by pointing to the film's examples of successful novice climbers. She purchased expensive gear and spent weeks learning how to use each piece, watching instructional videos, and practicing in her apartment. She also invested in a personal trainer for 2 months to improve her basic fitness level. The summit push began at Camp 4 at 26,000 feet, during a narrow weather window that opened after 3 days of waiting in deteriorating conditions. Temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit with 60 miles per hour winds that created a wind chill, approaching minus 80 degrees. At this altitude, oxygen levels are 1/3 of sea level, causing rapid physical and mental deterioration in even the most experienced climbers. The human body literally begins dying in the death zone, as cells break down faster than they can repair themselves. Most experienced climbers spend less than 16 hours above 26,000 feet to minimize exposure to these lethal conditions. The mountain's upper reaches present a landscape of exposed rock, ice, and snow where every step requires deliberate effort and precise foot placement. Jet stream winds regularly exceed 100 miles per hour, creating conditions where exposed skin freezes in minutes and wind-driven ice particles feel like sandpaper against any exposed flesh. The thin air makes every movement exhausting, and climbers must rest after every few steps to avoid complete collapse from oxygen deprivation. Dara's body, completely unaccustomed to altitude, was already showing signs of severe acute mountain sickness at base camp weeks earlier. Her resting heart rate had increased from 65 beats per minute at sea level to 110 beats per minute at 17,400 feet. She experienced persistent headaches that felt like someone driving nails into her skull, nausea that prevented her from eating solid food, and difficulty sleeping that left her exhausted before each day's activities. Her oxygen saturation levels consistently measured below normal ranges, indicating her body's inability to efficiently process the limited oxygen available at altitude. Her expedition leader expressed serious concerns about Dara's fitness level during the acclimatization rotations up the Khumbu icefall. She struggled to complete basic tasks at 17,000 feet that experienced climbers handled routinely without breathing hard. During the first rotation to Camp 1, she required frequent rest stops every 50 feet and fell behind the group's pace by over an hour. Her breathing became labored after minimal exertion, sounding like someone who had just sprinted a mile, and she showed visible signs of distress, including pale skin, trembling hands, and cold sweats that soaked through her base layers. The guide noticed that Dara couldn't maintain her balance on relatively flat terrain and stumbled frequently over small rocks and ice formations that other climbers navigated easily. Her coordination was noticeably impaired, and she had difficulty performing simple tasks, like clipping and unclipping her safety harness from fixed ropes. When other climbers offered advice about technique or gear usage, she listened carefully and tried to implement their suggestions, though she sometimes became frustrated when her body couldn't execute what her mind understood. At the second camp at 21,000 feet, she vomited repeatedly and couldn't keep food down for more than an hour at a time. The vomit was initially clear liquid, then progressed to yellow bile as her stomach emptied completely. Her appetite disappeared entirely, and she lost 12 pounds in 5 days, leaving her face gaunt and her climbing harness atoms loose around her shrinking waist. Despite her physical struggles, Dara showed remarkable determination and mental toughness, continuing to wake up each morning ready to attempt the day's objectives. She was a quick learner when it came to basic rope work and showed excellent judgment about weather conditions, often being the first to notice incoming storms. Her movements became increasingly clumsy due to altitude effects, and she dropped essential gear multiple times, including her water bottle and spare gloves that had to be retrieved by other team members. However, she demonstrated strong problem-solving skills and remained calm under pressure during technical sections of the climb. Dara's coordination became noticeably impaired beyond normal altitude effects, and she stumbled frequently while walking on the level ground inside the camp. Her speech became slurred, and she appeared confused about basic instructions that she had understood clearly at lower altitudes. She would stare blankly when given directions and often asked the same questions repeatedly within minutes. During conversations with other climbers, Dara's responses became increasingly disconnected from reality. She spoke confidently about reaching the summit while simultaneously complaining about symptoms that clearly indicated severe altitude sickness. When experienced climbers shared stories about previous expeditions, she would interrupt with references to her documentary, insisting that the film had shown her everything she needed to know about high-altitude climbing. During the final acclimatization rotation to Camp 3 at 24,000 feet, Dara had developed a persistent cough that produced pink-tinged sputum, indicating early signs of high-altitude pulmonary edema as fluid began accumulating in her lungs. She also complained of severe chest pain that worsened with deep breathing and felt like someone sitting on her chest. The guide measured her oxygen saturation at 68% using a pulse oximeter, well below the 85%, but she at minimum considered safe for continued ascent. Normal oxygen saturation at sea level ranges from 95 to 100%, meaning her blood was carrying dangerously inadequate oxygen to her vital organs. Her fingernails and lips showed a blue tinge called cyanosis, indicating severe oxygen deprivation that was becoming life-threatening. Dara's sleep became increasingly disrupted by a condition called Cheney-Stokes breathing, where her respiratory rate would increase rapidly, then slow down, then stop entirely for up to 30 seconds before resuming. This irregular breathing pattern indicated her brain's respiratory control centers were being affected by oxygen deprivation and altitude-induced swelling. She would wake up gasping for air multiple times each night, leaving her exhausted and disoriented each morning. The night before the summit push, Dara's oxygen saturation levels dropped to 72%, despite supplemental oxygen flowing at 2 liters per minute, and she was showing early signs of cerebral edema, including severe headache, projectile vomiting, and difficulty maintaining balance while standing still. The guide recommended she descend immediately, explaining that her symptoms indicated life-threatening altitude sickness that would only worsen with further ascent to the death zone. She referenced the documentary she'd watched repeatedly, claiming that people in similar condition had pushed through and made it to the summit. The guide explained that those were experienced climbers with years of high-altitude training and physiological adaptations that she lacked entirely. including increased red blood cell counts and enlarged lung capacity, developed over years of altitude exposure. Dara dismissed his concerns and said the film showed that determination was more important than experience or physical conditioning. She insisted that if she just followed the same route and used supplemental oxygen, like in the documentary, she would be fine. When the guide explained the specific medical danger she faced, including brain swelling that could cause coma or death, and fluid in her lungs that could cause drowning at altitude, Dara accused him of trying to prevent her from achieving her dream. She threatened to find another guide or attempt the summit alone if he refused to continue, a threat that would likely result in her death within hours. The guide faced an impossible decision between abandoning a paying client who might attempt a solo summit in her deteriorated mental state or continuing with someone clearly unfit for the ascent. He documented her refusal to descend and her threats to continue alone, creating a legal record that she was making informed decisions against medical advice. At 11:30 p.m. on March 14th, the summit team began their final ascent from Camp 4 in conditions that tested even experienced climbers. Dara required assistance putting on her gear and couldn't operate her headlamp without help, fumbling with the simple on-off switch for several minutes. Her movements were slow and uncoordinated, and she stumbled twice while walking the short distance from her tent to the departure point. The guide noted her labored breathing and glassy-eyed expression, but felt obligated to honor her insistence on continuing. The initial ascent proceeded slowly, as Dara fell behind the group's pace within the first hour, creating a dangerous situation as other climbing teams backed up behind them on the narrow route. At 25,500 feet, she stopped frequently to rest and complained of severe dizziness that made her feel like the mountain was spinning around her. Her oxygen flow rate was set to 4 liters per minute, near maximum flow, but her untrained cardiovascular system couldn't efficiently utilize even the enriched air mixture. The guide stayed close to her position, recognizing the increasing signs of altitude-related illness that were becoming more severe with each 100 feet of elevation gain. Dara's speech became increasingly slurred, and she began making statements that didn't make sense, including asking about weather conditions while standing in a clear night with visible stars. Her coordination deteriorated to the point where she needed assistance with each step on technical sections. Despite her deteriorating condition, Dara maintained her methodical approach, carefully checking her gear at each rest stop and following the guide's instructions precisely when she could understand them. She showed flashes of her former competence, correctly identifying potential hazards on the route and suggesting safer alternatives for the anchor points. At 26,800 feet, Dara began showing signs of severe confusion, asking the guide multiple times what mountain they were climbing and seeming genuinely surprised by his answers. She complained that her vision was becoming blurry and that she was seeing double images of her headlamp beam. These symptoms indicated that brain swelling was affecting her visual cortex and cognitive functions in ways that would only worsen with continued ascent. Her breathing became increasingly labored, despite maximum oxygen flow, and she began making a rattling sound with each breath that indicated fluid accumulation in her lungs. The guide recognized this as a sign of high-altitude pulmonary edema progressing to dangerous levels. Dara's lips and fingernails showed increasing cyanosis, turning from pink to blue to almost purple as her blood oxygen levels continued dropping. At 27,500 feet, she began stumbling more frequently and couldn't maintain her balance on relatively flat sections of the route. Her movements became unsteady and unpredictable, and she veered towards the edge of the narrow ridge multiple times, requiring the guide to physically restrain her from walking off the mountain. She seemed unaware of the danger and became irritated when he prevented her from moving in directions that would have resulted in a fatal fall. Dara's mental state continued deteriorating as they approached 28,000 feet. She began talking to people who weren't there, having conversations with characters from the documentary she'd watched. She would stop climbing and gesture toward empty space, apparently responding to voices that only she could hear. The guide realized she was experiencing hallucinations caused by severe brain swelling and oxygen deprivation. At 2:47 a.m., approximately 1,000 feet below the summit on the southeast ridge near the balcony area, Dara collapsed without warning during what appeared to be a normal rest stop. Her legs simply gave out, and she fell forward onto the snow-covered rock face, landing hard on her knees and then pitching forward onto her face. Her supplemental oxygen had been flowing at maximum rate for 6 hours, but her untrained body couldn't process even the enriched air efficiently enough to prevent complete system failure. The guide immediately checked her vital signs and found her pulse rapid and weak at 145 beats per minute, indicating her heart was working desperately to pump oxygen-depleted blood to her vital organs. Her breathing was shallow and rapid at 35 breaths per minute, more than double the normal rate, as her body attempted to compensate for the lack of available oxygen at extreme altitude. She began exhibiting clear signs of high-altitude cerebral edema, including severe confusion, complete loss of coordination, and profoundly altered mental state. When the guide asked her basic questions like her name and location, she gave incoherent responses that consisted of random words, strung together without meaning. Her pupils were dilated and unresponsive to light from his headlamp, indicating increased pressure in her brain from fluid accumulation that was compressing vital neural structures. The guide immediately recognized the life-threatening symptoms and began emergency descent procedures, knowing that every minute at this altitude was causing further brain damage. He attempted to help her stand, but Dara's legs couldn't support her weight, and she collapsed again within seconds, her knees buckling completely. Her speech became completely unintelligible, consisting of mumbled words and sounds that made no sense, interspersed with long periods of silence where she stared blankly at the snow. Before we continue with Dara's final moments, hit subscribe if you want more jaw-dropping stories of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. Despite her deteriorating mental state, she kept making weak gestures toward the summit and seemed to believe she was still climbing upward rather than lying collapsed on the mountain. Her movements were uncoordinated and purposeless, like someone trying to swim while lying on dry ground. The guide realized her brain was so oxygen-starved that she had lost all awareness of her actual situation and physical position. Dara became combative and disoriented when the guide tried to turn her around for descent, a common symptom of severe cerebral edema, as brain swelling affects personality and judgment centers. She pushed away his attempts to help with surprising strength for someone in her condition and crawled forward on her hands and knees toward the summit, moving only a few feet before collapsing again from exhaustion. Her movements were erratic and uncontrolled, and she seemed unaware that she was crawling rather than walking. Even in her severely altered mental state, she kept making disconnected statements about reaching the top like the climbers in the documentary, her obsession with the film persisting even as her brain function deteriorated. She would mumble fragments of scenes she remembered, mixing them with her current situation in ways that showed complete disconnection from reality. The guide realized she was experiencing severe delirium caused by brain swelling and oxygen starvation. At 28,200 feet, after crawling approximately 50 feet uphill in her delusional state, she suffered a complete physical collapse that left her unconscious on the narrow ridge. Her brain, starved of oxygen and swelling from fluid accumulation, began shutting down non-essential functions to preserve vital areas controlling breathing and heart rate. Her breathing became shallow and irregular, with long pauses between breaths that indicated respiratory failure as her brain stems struggled to maintain basic life functions. The guide checked for a pulse and found it weak and erratic, dropping from 145 beats per minute to 40 beats per minute as her cardiovascular system began failing under the extreme stress of altitude and cerebral edema. Her skin became cold and clammy despite the insulated clothing, indicating that her body was shutting down circulation to extremities to preserve blood flow to vital organs. Her breathing pattern became increasingly abnormal, following the Cheney-Stokes pattern, where respirations would increase in rate and depth, then gradually decrease, then stop entirely for periods lasting up to 45 seconds before resuming. This irregular breathing indicated that the respiratory control centers in her brain stem were being compressed by swelling tissue and were no longer functioning normally. The guide immediately radioed base camp for emergency evacuation, but helicopter rescue was impossible due to high winds exceeding 70 miles per hour and the extreme altitude that prevented aircraft operation above 26,000 feet under any conditions. The nearest helicopter landing zone was at base camp, over 11,000 feet below their current position, and requiring descent through technical terrain that would take hours even for an experienced climber. He attempted to drag her down the mountain, grabbing her under the arms and pulling her backward down the slope. At 150 pounds of dead weight plus 25 pounds of gear, progress was impossibly slow in the thin air, where every step required enormous effort and left him gasping for breath. After moving her only 30 feet in 10 minutes, he realized that dragging her at this pace would take hours they didn't have, and his own oxygen supply was running dangerously low. Dara's breathing became increasingly irregular, with periods of complete respiratory arrest lasting up to 30 seconds, followed by brief periods of rapid, shallow breathing. Her skin turned blue from lack of oxygen, starting with her lips and fingernails and spreading to her face and neck. Her body temperature began dropping rapidly in the -40-degree conditions as her circulation failed and her body lost the ability to generate heat. The guide continued dragging her downward for over 200 vertical feet, stopping every few minutes to check her vital signs and adjust her oxygen mask. Her condition showed no improvement despite the slight decrease in altitude, indicating that the brain damage from prolonged oxygen deprivation and swelling had progressed beyond the point where descent could reverse the process. Her pulse became increasingly weak and irregular, sometimes disappearing entirely for several seconds before returning. At 3:23 a.m., while positioned on a small ledge at 28,000 feet, Dara's breathing stopped entirely during one of the respiratory pauses and did not resume. The guide immediately began rescue breathing, removing her oxygen mask and forcing air into her lungs while checking for a pulse in her neck. Her heart continued beating weakly for several minutes, but her brain had been without adequate oxygen for too long to sustain life, and the swelling had compressed vital structures beyond recovery. The guide attempted resuscitation efforts for 12 minutes, alternating between rescue breathing and chest compressions while fighting his own oxygen deprivation at extreme altitude. His efforts were hampered by the bulky winter clothing, the awkward position on the narrow ledge, and his own exhaustion from hours of climbing and the stress of the emergency. Her heart eventually stopped responding to resuscitation attempts, and her body became completely still. The extreme altitude and his own oxygen deprivation made continued efforts impossible as the guide began showing signs of altitude sickness himself, including severe headache and nausea that indicated that he was approaching his own physiological limits. He realized that continuing resuscitation attempts would likely result in his own death without any possibility of saving Dara, whose brain damage was clearly irreversible. The guide's radio call reached base camp at 4:15 a.m., reporting Dara's death and his own precarious position on the mountain with limited oxygen supplies. No rescue aircraft could operate at that altitude in the current weather conditions, and the nearest medical facility was a 12-hour descent away under ideal conditions that didn't exist in the current storm. Other climbing teams in the area were dealing with their own emergencies as 2 other climbers had also collapsed that night during the same weather window, stretching rescue resources beyond capacity. The guide remained with Dara's body for 2 hours, using the time to rest and conserve his remaining oxygen while waiting for weather conditions to improve enough for safe descent. He documented the scene with photographs and GPS coordinates for the official report and future body recovery efforts. The extreme conditions and remote location made immediate body recovery impossible, requiring specialized teams and favorable weather that wouldn't occur for weeks. His own oxygen supply was running critically low, and he began showing symptoms of altitude sickness that would become life-threatening if he remained at that elevation much longer. He marked her location with GPS coordinates and left identifying information with the body for future recovery efforts, then began his own descent before conditions deteriorated further. The decision to leave her body was difficult, but necessary to prevent a second fatality. Dara's body remained on the mountain for 10 days until weather conditions and logistics allowed a recovery team to reach her location at 28,000 feet. The recovery required a team of experienced high-altitude climbers who spent 2 days reaching her position, and another day preparing the body for transport down the mountain through technical terrain that required specialized equipment and techniques. The regional medical facility conducted a thorough examination after the body's recovery. The official report listed cause of death as high-altitude cerebral edema, complicated by pulmonary edema, both conditions directly caused by her body's inability to function at extreme altitude. Contributing factors included inadequate physical conditioning, insufficient acclimatization time, and an underlying heart murmur that she had never disclosed during medical screening, which made her cardiovascular system unable to cope with the extreme demands of high-altitude climbing. The case was ruled an accidental death with no criminal liability assigned to the expedition company. Investigators noted that the victim had misrepresented her medical history and physical capabilities during the screening process, signing waivers that acknowledged the extreme risks involved. The climbing outfitters' existing medical questionnaires and liability waivers were deemed legally sufficient, and no policy changes were implemented following the incident. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here.